So in the last section, we looked at callbacks in some detail, and we learned about the different problems with callbacks. So they had some major flaws with them. And even though having these major flaws, they've been used quite extensively in JavaScript for over 2 decades. Now in ES6, a new iteration of JavaScript came along, and in that update, promises were added. And as we mentioned briefly in the last video, promises address most of the issues that we discussed previously. So the synchronous requirements, the callback hell or code organization, the difficulty with error handling, and the biggest of all, which was the inversion of control problem. Now, possible solutions to this obviously were previously discussed, and the developer community sort of put forward some solutions, and essentially they boil down to the need to have a way to take control back. Instead of inverting the control, you want to take the control back. So we're going to take the example that we had previously with the waiting for example, and we're going to look at how promises address all of these problems that we looked at previously with callbacks, and why obviously promises should be used in place of callbacks whenever possible. So we're going to discuss promises in a lot of detail, and we're going to look at what promises are. So essentially, the definition of a promise is, in the dictionary we get, is that it's a declaration or assurance that one will do something or that a particular thing will happen. And in terms of JavaScript asynchronous operations, this means that the same thing really, with a few more additions. So with promises, we can be rest assured that an operation will do what we expect it to do, or it's going to let us know that it can't fulfill that promise that it made initially. So before looking at a promise, we can say that it's going to behave in the following way. So it's going to notify us if the async operation is successful or if it's failed, and it's going to have a status. It's going to either be pending, if the operation is still ongoing, it's going to be fulfilled, the operation has now completed, or it's rejected. So some error happened and the promise has been rejected, and we're going to get notification of this. Also, once the async operation is completed, it can't be interfered with, which is really important on the part of passing callbacks, is that once it's finished, it can't be interfered with. That is, we can't call the completion method multiple times, and each time the async operation completes, it's the final and only one value that's returned. So that's quite a lot of theory. Let's actually look at an example of how we can actually use promises. So right now we have the waiting for callback implementation, and what we're going to do now is we're going to take this implementation, but we're going to convert it to now use a promise instead of a callback version. So we're going to create a function. I'm going to call this waiting for 2 for now, and it's going to be promise based. So it's going to take the same parameter, which is going to be the name, and then we're going to return a new promise. So we're just going to look at the syntax of the promise, and then we're going to explain it in detail. So here we're returning a new promise here. So it's a promise object. So this is natively available. So this was introduced in ES6, and pretty much all browsers now support this out of the bag. So it returns a new promise, and the new promise here takes an executor function first of all. So this executor function is going to be the function that's going to get executed in the constructor of the promise. We're going to look at that in more detail later on. So as you can see here, this here is the executor function, and that's what you pass to the promise. This gets invoked immediately. Now you're going to then be passed 2 functions. You're going to get passed a resolve, and you're going to get passed a reject function. So the resolve function is called when the value has been calculated and it has been reached. So you've done your operation, you've read something from the database, you've got the value. Now you want to say, yes, I want to resolve this promise. You call the resolve, and then you pass in the name. In our case here, we had this set timeout, and after 2 seconds, what we're going to do is we're going to resolve with the name if the name does not equal Mike, if you remember previously. So if the name is not Mike, we're going to resolve it to name. And if the name is equal to Mike, then we're going to reject it. So we're going to call the reject function that we get passed, or that's passed to the executor function that we pass here. So there's quite a few things going on here. We have to be a little bit sort of careful in terms of the different way things are working together here. So this here is called an executor function, and you pass this function to the new promise as a parameter. And now when the promise here, when its constructor runs in under the hood, it's going to execute this immediately. And then you will be given these two as parameters to that function that gets executed in the constructor of the promise. Hopefully that makes sense. So then inside of that now, when that is executed, or when this function that you pass is called, then it's going to basically give you these two parameters, and then inside of the function that you give, you can then decide whenever you want to resolve the function or you want to reject it if there is an error. So this is how we can convert the callback function to a promise. So in the last video, we looked at how to create our promise. So basically creating a promise implementation on the waiting for callback function that we had previously. So how do we actually now use this promise that we've just created? So what I'm going to do for now, I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to set this to be waiting for, so we don't have the same variable with the same name. And how do we use this promise now? So what can we do with it, and how do we actually invoke a promise? So that's what we're going to be learning here next. So we're going to call waiting for. So same way that we did previously, we're going to call waiting for, and we're going to pass in the person that we're waiting for. So it's then going to say waiting for Abdi, and then it's going to wait for 2 seconds, and it's going to resolve. Now previously that happened immediately. So previously, if you remember, we had the waiting for, and then we applied, or we supplied a second parameter to the waiting for here. At this moment, it's only going to take a single parameter, and that's it. So we return a new promise here. Now promises have they can be chained along. So it's going to return a new promise. So that's exactly what we've done. So it's returned a new promise within the promise. We're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. It might be a bit confusing at this moment in time. But essentially what this means is that we can call a then method. So promises have thenables on them. So we'll call a then method. When the promise is fulfilled, the then function is where we can attach a callback to that we can get the value out of this promise on. So we're going to call a .then. So this here is coming from the promise here. So this is a promise. Okay, so this returns a promise, and that's exactly what we've done here. Yeah? So we've returned the promise, and since we've returned that and we're getting a new instance of promise here, that instance has several different properties on them. And one of those, or the main one of those, is the then function here, or the then method. Now the then method itself takes a callback function that will be called when your promise value is ready. So we're going to pass it a callback function. I'm going to pass it here an arrow function, and we're going to get the name of the person. You can call it whatever you want here, but we're going to just call it name, and we're going to log out the name of the person that we get back here. So it says waiting for, and after about 2 seconds, again depending on the task queue or the callback queue, we then resolve our promise with the name that we passed in initially. And then this is what happens here. When the promise fulfills, it calls the then method, and it calls this function that we've passed it, and it gives it the value that we resolved it in here. So just to make that really clear, we're going to set this to be value, and after about 2 seconds, that's the value that we get back here. So this is the resolved. So this bit here is the piece of code that is getting executed when the promise resolves. So, and that's what we get here, Abdi. So the promise here has a then method on it. Now, if you remember previously, if the name is Mike, what happens is that it's actually an error. And previously we call our callback and we pass in a new error object here. So we're doing the same thing here, but this time we're using the provided reject function that's given to us by the promise. So if you remember, this is the executor function, and within that function we get passed two parameters. One is a resolve function and one is a reject function. In the happy state, we call the resolve function and we pass in the value, and then after about 2 seconds, or when the promise resolves, we can call .then, pass in a callback function and get that value back from the resolve there. If something goes wrong, things don't go to plan, there's an error, what happens is that the reject function is going to be called and it's going to pass in a new error object here, as we've done previously with the callback version. So let's now set this to be Mike here. Yeah, so if we do Mike and we save that out, it says waiting for Mike. and we get an error here. So as you can see here, it says an uncaught promise, or in the promise error, Mike is always late. So this here is the error that we generated if you look at the code here. So a new error object here, and basically give it the message, or give it the string to the error object, and that's what we get here. Notice here, uncaught in promise here. So this here is giving away a lot of details here. So that means that you can actually catch errors. So you can actually catch an error that's been generated by the promise here. So when you say reject here, that's going to generate a new error, and that error can be caught within the promise itself. And how do we do that? Well, the then function actually takes multiple parameters. And the first parameter is when the promise was successful. So if you remember, we said that the promise can be in several different states. In particular, it can be in 3 states. It can be pending. So the promise is still sort of hasn't resolved yet. And that's within the 2 seconds that we specify. So until the 2 seconds elapse, our promise is pending. And once the promise fulfills, or once we resolve the promise here, when we call resolve and we pass in the value, then the promise is settled and it's fulfilled. And when it's fulfilled, it calls this first parameter there, or it calls this parameter that you pass, which is a callback function, and it gives us the value that the promise was fulfilled or settled with. Now, in the case where the promise is not fulfilled and it's rejected, what happens is that it's going to call a second parameter here. And the second parameter, again, is going to be another function here. And this function is where you catch that error. So you're going to catch that error, and then you're going to do something with that error that you've just caught there. So if you save this out now, and we're going to wait for Mike, and this time we don't have an uncaught error. So we don't have an uncaught in promise. So previously we had the uncaught in promise. Right now we've catched that error. And what we're doing here is we're logging that error out. And as you can see here, that's exactly the error that we get, and we get the stack call trace here as well. So the then function takes 2 parameters. It takes the fulfilled parameter and it takes the rejected, and both of these are callback functions that we can supply. And what you'll notice here is that immediately we've flipped the inversion of control here. So instead of us passing a callback for us to be called back, we're now getting notification. So if you can liken this to be like a buzzer, or like a pager, if you're old enough, from the 90s, where you get a buzz, so it bleeps several times, and you're notified to either, if you're a doctor or something like that, to make a call, if you're on call, and to do something. So you get notification if something happens. So it's the same process here. So we're getting a notification when the promise fulfills, and when it does fulfill, then we can do something here. If it fails, we can also do something as well and handle that error. Now, we mentioned the problems with callback functions previously, and the major issue was the inversion of control. Now, there's a way we can handle that. So it's still, you might say, at the end of the day, we're still passing a callback function here. What if the resolve is never called or reject is never called, which is absolutely feasible. It can actually happen. You're reliant on that being fulfilled on the other end by the third party. So that can happen. And with promises, there's also a mechanism to address that issue as well. But essentially what's happened here is that we've addressed the problem of passing a callback and just hoping that we get notified. Whereas if it's a promise, it's either going to reject, it's either going to resolve, or it's going to reject the promise. And then we can do things based on either action or based on either thing that happens. So if it's fulfilled, then this unfulfilled function is called. If it's not fulfilled, the catch function is called here. And then we can do something and take steps to catch that error and do something about it. So this is essentially how promises work. Now, in terms of the way it's written here, in most promises, you won't actually see it written like this. In fact, what you'll see is that it will be as a catch method. So instead of having so I'm just going to remove that second parameter that I've added here, and I'm going to add a catch. I'm going to chain it onto here. So as you can see here, this returns a promise, and that promise here, we can attach a then, and this here is just another way to write the promise that we had. So I'm going to add my callback function here, and we're going to take the error object, and we're going to log this out onto the screen like so. So this is what you'll see in most promise implementations. So you'll see the promise, and then you see the then, and then you catch any errors that you see here. So this catch here is just a wrapper for, so let's just do it here. So we had then, so it's just a wrapper for then, and then you pass null, and then you pass in your callback function like so. So you can log out the error, you can catch that error, and so on. So essentially here, this catch here is acting like this here, but this is more intuitive to write. And this is the implementation that you'll see a lot. So you're going to have the waiting for, then if that happens, then we're going to fulfill the function or fulfill the promise and get the value back. Otherwise, we can catch that error. Now, this here addresses the problem with the way in which we think about things in a synchronous, sequential sort of manner. So you can say if this happens, so we've got the waiting for, and then we get the value, and then we catch it here. But at the end of the day, this is actually asynchronous. But by looking at the code here, it's a lot more easier to reason about in our head. So the way we think about it and the way we can actually see it in the syntax here actually makes sense, and this matches up. So this is immediately resolving some of the issues that we highlighted with callback issues with the synchronous requirements and how our brain works. And also, as we'll see next, we've got rid of the problem of the code organization and the callback hell. So promises immediately solve a lot of issues that we had with callbacks. And as you can see, it's a lot more cleaner, and we can reason about the code in somewhat sequential manner, even though it's not actually sequential. But the way in which we think about it is, we're going to do something, we're going to then wait for it, and then we're going to catch that error. So first step, second step, and third step, and so on. So it's a lot easier to reason about. And immediately, as you can see, it's a lot cleaner. Now, you might be wondering why our promise isn't actually caught here. And that's because we've got console, not console.log here. So if we do console.log, then that should actually go away, because obviously console itself is just the object, and that isn't a function. And that's why we had that error previously. So promises solve a lot of problems that we had already with callback functions. So at the top here, I've just pasted the nested callbacks example that we looked at previously. So as you can see here, the nested callbacks with that flying arrow, and also the nested nature of the callback function. So we had the waiting for, and then we call it multiple times, and it's all nested, and it's all reliant on each other. And it was quite messy, as you can see here. So you had that callback hell. It's very difficult to read, very difficult to understand, and most definitely it's very difficult to maintain. So and also looked at the error handling issues as well. So we're going to look at how promises addresses that particular problem by organizing the code a lot better and making it easier to read. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call. So we're going to start with Abdi. So we're going to wait for Abdi, and then we're going to do some chaining here. Okay, so we can chain multiple times. So we don't only just get a then. Each then in itself generates a new promise, and we're going to understand that in more detail very soon. So we're going to add another chain. Is we're going to say then, and then we can wait for somebody else inside this then here. So we're going to wait for Abdi, and then we're going to expect that to be back. So we're going to say set this to be Abdi, like so. So I'm going to set that parameter to be Abdi because that's the person we're waiting for. And then inside of this particular then here, what we can do is we can return something, or we can return implicitly with ES6. So we're going to say, instead of just logging that out, we're going to make another call to waiting for. So we're going to say waiting for, and this time we're going to wait for Michelle, just like we had previously. So we're going to get Abdi back as the value, okay? And then we're going to wait for Michelle. So we're returning another promise here. So you can imagine this to be one promise, and then we've got the then from this promise here. Then this then returns another promise that we can then use on another then function call here. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to chain multiple thens here. And this time we expect Michelle to be returned for us in the happy state. And we're going to wait for someone else. So we're going to call waiting for promise again. And this time we're going to wait for Fahad, like so. And then we can continue. So we can wait for more people. So we're going to wait for Adam, just like we waited for him previously. So we should now get back Fahad from the previous promise in the chain. And then we're going to wait for Adam as well. And then once we wait for Adam, then we say, that's it. I think we're not going to wait for anyone else. And then we're going to add a final then here. And we're going to just give it a callback function. And once this is executed, we can just then simply log out a message and say that, great. So we can then say, great, we've got everyone. And then we just log that message out here. So as you can see here, we wait for Abdi, wait for Michelle, wait for Fahad, wait for Adam. And then once we've got everyone, we're going to say, great, we've got everyone. And then we can actually use that value that was returned. So as you can see here, each chain in this promise here is returning a new promise. So this is the original promise. And then we're returning a new promise from then, which itself is a promise, as we'll see when we look at promises in more detail in a few steps. And then we're chaining a dot then on this promise that's returned. And then here we give it a callback function, and then we return a new promise, and then we chain another then on that promise there. And then finally we say no more chaining. We're not going to return any more promises. And then we're going to simply log out. We've got everyone here. So this is promise chaining. So we can chain multiple items here. So you can imagine this to be like, say you're reading something from a database, and then you're sending something back, and then you're updating the database again, and then you're rendering something onto the screen, and multiple things. You can chain multiple promises like this here. And just compare this one here to what we had here. Obviously, we've got this commented out at the moment, but as you can see here, this is a lot complex. There's a lot happening here. It's very noisy. It's very difficult to understand. It's very difficult to reason about. It's very difficult to maintain, and it's very difficult to do error handling, as we saw previously. Here, if there's an error, so let's say instead of waiting for Fahad, we're going to wait for Mike, which is going to blow everything up. So we're going to wait for Mike. So we're going to say waiting for Abdi, waiting for Michelle, and then we're going to waiting for Mike. Boom, run into an error. So Mike is always late here. So what happens is the code jumps from here and it's caught by this catch error here. So this acts as a catch-all for each chain of thens that we have here. So this is going to catch any error that gets sort of thrown anywhere in this chain. And once Mike is obviously encountered, it's going to say, nope, that's going to be an error right there. And then we can catch it with our catch block, as you can see here. So this acts as a catch-all here. And this acts in a similar way that we saw with the callback itself. What we can do is we've got better error handling. In fact, we can handle the error in line. So each then has got its own error handler. So we can say, instead of this being as a catch-all here, we can attach a then or a catch onto each method, onto each then separately. And then we can catch that error. And we're going to see that next. So now we're going to look at the example where we can handle multiple catches. So we can handle multiple errors within our chain of promises here. So right now we've got the single catch here. And this catch is going to act as a catch-all for all errors that get thrown in any part of this promise chain here. And previously we said that this behaves similar to the callback functions, where if one callback is or throws an error, then the execution stops there, and then that error is then obviously logged to the screen, and then you can do something with it inside that particular nested callback function. But now we're going to demonstrate the power of error handling with promises here. So I've got a function here, a helper function, which is called log name. So we're just going to use this one here to log the name of the person. So if the name is equal to late, it's going to say Mike will be late. Otherwise, it's going to log out, great, so-and-so is here. And then that's what's going to get logged to the console here. So we're going to use that and we're going to use it inside the catch methods. Okay, so, or we're going to use it inside the then method rather. So now we've got the first promise here, which is waiting for, and then we're chaining off immediately with the then call here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually, instead of calling that directly implicitly, I'm going to wrap it in a curly brace. I'm going to paste that in here, and I'm going to return that promise because we were returning implicitly before, and I'm going to call my log name function like so. I'm going to pass in the value that we get back from the then there. So in fact, let's just call this name like so, just to make it a little bit more consistent. And then we're going to do the same thing with the other then calls. Okay, so now we've got the refactored our then functions to now include the log function that we're using. So we're going to now add a catch block for each then method. So instead of calling and attaching another then, we're going to catch any errors that may arise from this promise here. So remember, this then here, it returns another promise. So any errors that arise, we want to catch that and we'll handle that error directly that may come from waiting for Michelle. So we're going to catch that error. And what we're going to do here is, remember, the catch here is a wrapper for .then, and pass null as the first parameter, and then we pass the second parameter, which is a callback function to handle the error. So I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see the screen much better, like so. So now we've got the catch method there. And what's happening is we're going to catch any error that gets thrown from Michelle. And then we're going to log out. I'm going to say error waiting for Michelle. So we're going to catch any errors that may arise from waiting for Michelle. Okay. And we can also return something from this catch method. But since we're pretty confident that there is going to be an error likely, we're going to just leave it at that. So we're just simply going to call console.log, and then this catch here, it's going to basically not return anything for it on the next chain of the then call. So hopefully that's going to resolve, and this one will be called, and the catch is not going to be called for the next then in the chain. Hopefully this will make sense in just a moment. So now we've got its own catch handler for this then here. So this then here has its own catch handler, and we've got it right here. Any errors that come from waiting for Michelle, we can catch it there directly. And then we can continue. We can continue the execution here. Now we're going to return waiting for Mike here. So we're going to return waiting for Mike, and we haven't logged Mike's name. So we're just going to, or haven't logged Michelle's name rather. So previously, if everything is okay in the happy state, we're going to log whoever we're waiting for. We're going to say, great, we've got the person is here, and we're going to wait for somebody else. So this time we're going to wait for Mike. And as you know, Mike obviously is going to return some kind of an error because every time waiting for Mike, Mike is always late. So he's going to have a special catch handler for that. So we can expect an error for him. And when we wait for Mike, and whenever that is the case, then we know that yes, Mike, error waiting for Mike, and then we're going to return late here. So we can actually return something from the catch function. And if you remember, catch is just a wrapper around the null and then the second parameter to the then function call here. So we're going to return something here, and whatever we return here is going to then be made available to us inside the next then chain here. So inside the next then chain is going to be made available to us here. So we're going to add one more catch for Adam. So in case we have an error with Adam, so we're going to wait for Adam there, and then we're going to catch any errors that may arise from waiting for Adam. And if there are any errors, then we're simply going to log that there. And then the chain is going to then continue to the bottom there. And then we've got one catch here for this. If for any reason there's an error thrown, or there's a type error in the function that we pass here, for whatever reason, we can catch that error right here and log that error out. So I'm just going to save this out here, and then let's actually look through what happens. So we're going to wait for Abdi. Abdi's here, waiting for Michelle. Michelle's here, waiting for Mike. Error while waiting for Mike. Mike is always late. And then we continue. Mike will be late again. And then waiting for Adam. And then great, we've got everyone. So as you can see here, the error handling is a lot more easier to understand and reason about here. And it's a lot more powerful. So each then here has its own error handler. And unlike the previous example where whenever we ran into an error, we had to stop the execution. So this time we can actually just say, yes, we've run into an error. Mike is always late. Error waiting for Mike. Mike will be late again. And then we can return something and then we can just continue. And whatever we return there is going to be the value for the next chain or the next then in the chain. And then we can now use that if we want to. And then we can continue our chain of execution here. So you can imagine this to be, say you're writing something to the database, you're making an external API call. For whatever reason, in your chain of calls here, if you have an error, you can then do something based on that error. You can continue with your chain of executions. So you don't have to actually abort your operation, your async operation that you were doing as you would have to in the previous example where we had a single catch, or in the callback example. So as you can see here, error handling is a lot more powerful here, and we've got fine-grained control of exactly what it is that we want to do once we encounter an error. So we can continue our program execution. We can continue on to the next chain of then. We can leave it there. You know, we've got lots of options here as opposed to the previous callback example version that we looked at. You know, you don't really have many options, and you'd have to do quite a lot of things to get the similar behavior as you can see here out of the box with promises. So we looked at error handling, and obviously in this process we can see that we can chain off multiple .then calls to our original promise here. And as we'll see, obviously each then actually returns a new promise. So this is a single promise, and then this is another promise, and then this is itself is a promise, and each chain here that we have is an individual promise that's actually being returned. Now I just wanted to highlight something here, that when we return a value from the then or catch function, it's made available to us in the next then or the catch block function. Now it's important to note that this will only work if we have immediately chained then and catch functions like we have in this example here. Now if we were to separate them out and then call then multiple times, this is actually not going to work. We're only going to get one settled value. So right now we have the waiting for Abdi, and then we have an immediate then after this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment this out. So I'm just going to comment that chain out for now. And then we've got this promise here. So we've got the original promise waiting for Abdi, and then we've got the name here, and then we're going to return the waiting for Michelle here. What do you think is going to happen now if I now assign this to a variable? So I'm going to assign a variable const promise, and I'm going to assign this to a variable promise here. I just want you to think about this sort of quickly, what you think will happen. So I'm going to do promise, and then I'm going to attach a then call onto this promise here. So I just want you to think about what might be the result here. So I'm going to pass a callback, and I'm going to log that name out here. So here we've got waiting for Abdi, and then in this promise here, what's happened is we actually get back the value that resolves for this promise that we've returned, which is waiting for Michelle. So as you can see here, if I just do a string on here, just to highlight this fact, the value that we get back for this promise is that we get back Michelle. So we wait for Abdi, great, Abdi's here, and then we return another promise, and then we get back here waiting for Michelle, and then we get the value Michelle back. Now if I were to do this again multiple times, so if I do .then again like this, and I do it a couple more times, and then we'll just wait for this to execute and each promise to settle, we get the same value here. So we get Michelle, 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 and that's because we now have a settled value. We're not chaining directly off the then call here. So if we were to chain a .then on here, then we're chaining off this then, and that itself is another promise, and then that then returns another then for us to chain off the value that is returned from this then. So what we did previously was exactly that. So we were able to chain off multiple .then calls directly off each then that we had in the chain of promises here. So that's just something to be really aware of. So each then and each catch function is a promise if we chain it off directly, as we've done in the example. If we don't do it and we do it separately, and we call each then separately, we only get the final settled promise value. So because we're returning a promise from here, we get the final settled promise value, which is Michelle, and that's what we get here on the console. And as I've mentioned already here, this is really powerful in the ability to chain off multiple .then calls here. So because it means we can do multiple async operations and mix them with non-async operations. Also, the way the code is structured is similar to the sequential manner that we're used to as we think about sort of asynchronous operations in our brain. My intention here is to help you get a deeper understanding of how promises really work, because I think, you have a lot of people who work with promises, but they don't fully deeply understand exactly how things are working and what they can do with it and what they can't do with it. So hopefully this sheds some light on exactly how it's actually working. What I'd like to do next is I want to have a look at an example which we mentioned about the inversion of control. We mentioned it previously, how the promises, or when promises were introduced, how this was able to fix that problem, to basically uninvert the inversion of control, so to get control back onto your code. So I want to look at an example with the e-commerce application that we looked at previously, and how that would work with promises. So now I have the implementation for the analytics and the e-commerce example that we looked at already with the callback version. So if you remember, we had the analytics object, and that was previously in the callback version. So now I've converted that to be promise based. So let's just assume that the analytics library that we're using now, it has a promise based sort of or a promise version that we can use. So typically this would be something like this. So it's going to return a new promise, it's going to process the data that we pass to it, and then it's going to resolve at some point, and it's just going to return true here. So now what's happening with the track purchase is that it returns a promise that we can then attach the .then calls onto. And we could do some other interesting stuff, as you will see. So if you remember, we had the charge card function and we had the display thank you function as well. So with the callback version, we gave a callback, and inside that callback, we were executing these two functions to finalize the transaction. So if you remember, we were inverting control. So we were basically handing critical control of our application to a third party, which is not really good. It's something you really want to avoid 100%. But with the callback version, there wasn't really any other way without sort of promises, or without writing extra boilerplate code to really cover your back and make sure that something sort of that you don't expect to happen, so you don't leave your application hanging. Maybe your callback is called multiple times, customer gets charged several times on their card, and so on. So you have to write a lot of boilerplate code, a lot of checks. You have to do a lot of defensive sort of coding around that. But promises fix that out of the box, and we're going to see exactly how it does that. So we've got the two functions here, charge credit card and the display thank you page. And then if you remember, we've got the purchase data as well here. So I'm just going to paste in a call to our promise here. So if you recall, obviously the track purchase now is a promise, and we're going to call that promise. So we're going to call that function, and we're going to pass in our purchase data. And if you obviously just looking at the code here, you can see that that returns a promise. And then after about 2 seconds, so we're going to mimic the async operation, it's going to resolve and going to give us back a true. So it's going to give us back a Boolean flag of true. So we've called the promise here, and after 2 seconds, that's going to resolve. So we haven't attached any handlers onto it just yet. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is I'm going to now create a new promise. So we're going to look at how we can handle the situation where we never get called back, or we never get, for whatever reason, the promise here doesn't resolve, or something happens, there's an issue, whatever it might be here. So in that case here, what we're going to do is we're going to create another promise. I'm going to call this a timer promise. And what this does is it creates a new promise. So we're doing this on our end. So we're going to use the native promise here, and we're going to use a set timeout, and we're going to resolve it after about 5 seconds. We're going to resolve it with false here. And we'll see exactly why we're going to do that. So we've got two promises here. We've got the track purchase promise and the timer promise that we've created ourselves here. So if I now just paste in the next piece of code here, so just to save typing that out. So we've got promise.race here. Now the promise specification, so you can look on the MDN docs here, it comes with several methods that we can use. And if you just look on here, you can see all the methods that are available on the Promise API here. So you've got the promise.raise, reject, resolve, and so on. So we've seen the way in which promises work. We can use a promise.raise here, and the promise.raise here takes an iterable of promises as input, and it returns a single promise here. So we're going to see how that works exactly with our own example here. So we're going to pass the promise.raise here. It takes an array of promises. So you can have like multiple promises. You can have 2, 3, 4, however many promises you need. And then we're going to race them against each other. So just like you have in a race in athletics, we're going to race these two promises. So we're going to race the analytics promise, which is this one here, and we're going to race the timer promise against each other. So whichever completes first, we're going to do something on it. And what this does here, it does several things. So it means that we get control back from passing it to the third-party library, to the third-party analytics library here, and basically give them a timer here. So we're going to say within 5 seconds, if that doesn't resolve, so if our track purchase does not resolve within 5 seconds, what's going to happen is this time promise is going to resolve. But the way things stand, with what we've got with the timer, how we're mimicking it, we've got 2 seconds. So hopefully within 2 seconds, this guy is going to run before this guy, even with the callback sort of in the event loop as well. In the callback queue, this should run before this one, because this one is going to get queued before this one, hopefully. And that will be the case. So what we're going to do now is we're going to say, we're going to give you 5 seconds to resolve. This, obviously, we've created this ourselves, but it might do it in 1 second, it might do it in 5 seconds, 10 seconds, we don't really know. So we're going to say within 5 seconds, we want to have a result here. And the promise.raise here, what it's going to do is going to take 2 promises, or any number of promises that you have, and it's going to race them against each other. So the promise to finish first will be resolved. So the promise to finish first will be resolved. So if this finishes first here, we're going to get the value that we get back from the track purchase. And as things stand, it's going to be a true value. And if the second promise, our timer promise, finishes first, we're going to get back false here. And then whatever result we get back here, we can attach a .then onto it, as you can see here. And in that .then, we're only going to get one result here. That one result that we get is going to be either the analytics promise or the timer promise. And based on each one, we can do an action based on that here. So we're going to say if the result is true, so in other words, the analytics has completed and everything is good to go, then we're able to call our finalize the charge credit card and display thank you functions here. And for whatever reason, if we don't get a callback, or we don't get a completion of the analytics promise, so the track purchase promise here, what we're going to do is it's going to wait for this promise to finish. It's going to wait for the timer promise to finish. And when that finishes, what's going to happen is we know that there's a problem with the analytics here. So we can still finalize our transaction just fine. And we can remedy the problem. So we can maybe make another call to record the purchase data. So maybe make a note of this in our database, and then put something in there to say that the analytics wasn't recorded, and we can try again at some later point here. But the main thing that I want you to understand here is that we have control of everything here. So we're basically saying we are in control. We're going to call the shots here. So we're going to say, if you give me a result back here, then this is the happy state. We can finalize the transaction. If for whatever reason you can't do it in 5 seconds, I'm not going to wait forever. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do my own thing. And I'm going to come back, maybe do another call to record record the purchase of the transaction in the analytics. I can do something else, but at the end of the day, I can finalize my transaction, and I'm not left hanging here. So as you can see here, this is really, really powerful. So we've uninverted the inversion of control here. So before we were handing control to a third party, now we have control of everything, as you can see here. So I'd like you to play about with this, and hopefully, if it doesn't make sense the first time, it will the second time. So I just want to look at one example where this finishes before the analytics purchase here. So once it does finish, there's going to be a problem with analytics, and then we can actually do whatever it is that we need to do to finalize the transaction, to remedy the problem, and basically we're not left hanging here. So we're in control of everything in our application. So we said previously, we want to look at promises in a lot more detail, and we want to understand exactly how it works and the way it works and why it works that way. And here I have the starting sort of point for our own implementation of the Promise API. So right now we've been using the native Promise API as provided by the JavaScript engine. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to actually create a custom implementation of the Promise API. Now it's not going to be a like for like. Obviously the native API or the native Promise has a lot more bells and whistles to it than obviously the one that we're going to be creating. But hopefully when we create this, you'll sort of appreciate the way in which the promise works and why it works that way. And then it will give you a better understanding of how promises work and how you can use them for a synchronous operation. So with that, let's actually start implementing our own promise sort of version, so to speak. So to create this, I've created a my promise class, as you can see here, and it's going to have a constructor and it's going to have the methods that we've been using so far in the native version. So it's going to have the then, it's going to have the catch, and then obviously it needs to have a resolve and reject methods. So if you're not sort of familiar with this syntax, with this hash before the resolve, it's to denote a private method. So you can actually look this up in the MDN here. So this is something that's not commonly sort of used. You might not see it in sort of many code bases. So if you want to have private methods, you can use the hash before the method and before the property, and then that's going to be made private for you. So that's what that there is for. So these two methods here, the resolve and the reject, are two private methods in our myPromise class. So the first thing that we need is we need some sort of state. So we're going to need to hold some sort of state within our promise. Now, if you remember how promises work, they're going to have three sort of distinct states. It's either going to be pending, fulfilled, or rejected. And to denote that, we're going to have a promise object. Now you can implement this as you like, but we're just going to stick an object above our class here. And this object is going to have pending, fulfilled, and rejected. And each one is going to resolve to the string in all lowercase. So you can do this in place, but it just makes it a lot more sort of easier and more consistent and less sort of error prone. So we're going to use this now. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the state. So initially the state is going to be pending, and we're going to set a value as well. So let me just paste that in here. So we have the state, and again, all this are going to be sort of private variables or private properties within the class here. So they're not going to be made public. We can't access them outside the class when we create an instance later on. So the state initially is going to be pending here. So we're going to set this to be pending because obviously when the promise is first created, the state is pending and it hasn't fulfilled and it hasn't rejected yet. And that's what we're going to be using. So we're going to say promise state dot pending, and then the value initially is just going to be null. So we haven't resolved the value. The promise hasn't settled yet. So we're going to have that to be initially null. And then we've got these two properties here, then callback and catch callback, and they're set to empty arrays. Now the then callback here is, if you remember, when we attached a .then to the promise or the native version of the waiting for function, that then was registered for us, and then it will be called back later on when the promise settles. So if the promise fulfills, all of the callback functions that are attached to or are passed to the then are added here. So you can have multiple thens. So with the example that we had, if we called a settled promise 3 times, they would be added to the then callback. And then if for whatever reason the promise failed, then the callback to catch that failed promise would be added here. So you can have multiple catches that you can have. You can catch the same error multiple times if you wish when the promise settles, either rejected or fulfilled. Okay, so that's what these are for. And as we obviously use them in the code, they're going to make a lot more sense. So that's our promise state so far. And then we're going to go into the constructor here. So if you remember, when we call the promise, so previously we were saying, so we're going to say new promise in the native version. And then when you say new promise, then if you remember, we were passing a callback function like this here. And in that callback function, we were getting the resolve and we were getting the reject functions to be passed to us here. And that function that we pass to the promise, which can be run in the constructor here, is called the executor function. So the executor function is what we're going to get here. And this executor function is what we pass when we instantiate a new promise, when we're calling it and when using it. So let's actually go into the body of our constructor here. So now, immediately when we run this, what's going to happen is it's going to call the executor function, and it's going to pass the function. So this is the function that we pass here. It's going to pass you the resolve and the reject functions that we can then use. So we're going to pass this dot resolve, and if you notice here, we haven't got the resolve implemented just yet, but we're going to pass this to the executor function as the first parameter. So this is the resolve function, and then we're also going to pass the this dot reject. So we've passed this dot resolve and this dot reject. Now, obviously, this will be executed in a different execution context. So we have to be careful. Since we're using this here, we need to make sure we've got the right version of this. So we have to bind it to our my promise version here, or we have to bind it to this particular object and this particular class. And to do that, we're going to use the bind function here that's available on all functions, and we're going to set this to be pointing to our particular my promise here. So this is just to make sure that when it calls, or when we call the reject or resolve functions, it's actually pointing to this object and nothing else at the time of execution. So I'm going to say this dot reject, and we're going to bind that. So we're going to get a new version. I'm going to set this to be pointing to our object again for the reject here. So we've called the function. Now, obviously, when you call this function here, now this function that we pass, when it's called, anything can happen. So there might be an error. There could be, there could be a type error. There could be a typo, whatever it is. In that case here, we need to think about that particular sort of scenario. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap that in a try and catch block. So we're going to try to run the function. If there's a problem, then we're going to catch that problem. And then once we catch that problem, we're going to immediately settle this promise. So we're going to call this dot reject. So we're going to reject it, because if there's an error with the function or the executor function that we passed, then we're going to immediately settle, and we're going to settle that with the error that we received from this attempt at trying to execute the executor function. So hopefully that makes sense there. So far we've got the executor function, and when we get that function, we execute it immediately. So we try to invoke that function immediately, and then we pass it the resolve and reject as the first and second parameter respectively here. And that's exactly how the pattern works, or the function signature works, when we instantiate a new promise instance here. So that's our constructor. We've got the state. Obviously, we've got the promise state there that we're going to then later on use the fulfilled and rejected. Next, we're going to look at the then function here, which is the workhorse of the promises. Okay, so far we've got our sort of bare bone implementation of our custom promise here. So we've got the state, we've got the constructor done, and now we're going to look at the then function. And as you mentioned before, this is the workhorse of the Promise API. So this is where most of the processing, most of the work is actually done. And that's what we're going to be adding right now. So if you remember, so the then function takes a callback. So it takes a callback, which is when it's fulfilled, and it can also take a second callback, which is when it's rejected. And that's what we're going to denote first. So we're going to take the onFulfilled callback that we can supply, and then again we can take the onRejected as well. So those are the two parameters that the then function, or the then method here, is actually going to take. Okay, so inside of the then now, there's a few things that we're going to need to do. So as you mentioned, there's a lot of sort of processing here. And before we write any code, let's just write out some pseudocode in comments. So what we're first going to do is we're going to need to return a new promise. And we mentioned this previously sort of several times. We said that the then itself is actually a new promise. So it's not the main promise that we have. It's actually a new promise in itself. And that's exactly what happens. So we're going to return a new promise. So we're going to return a new instance of my promise, and then that's going to be the next sort of part of the chain. And also, obviously, when we sort of look at it in use, it will make a lot of sense. So the first thing is we're going to need to do is return a new promise. Then once we've done that, we need to do a few things here. So we need to check the pending state. So we need to find out what's fulfilled, what's not fulfilled, and what we need to do. So I'm just going to make some space here, and we're going to do a check here. So we're going to check our state. Okay, so we're going to check the state, and we're going to check if the state is pending. So if pending, what we're going to do is we're going to save the functions. So we're going to save the functions to a callback array. So we had the then callback and the catch callback, so that we can save these functions such that later on when the promise settles, we can then call these functions back and pass in the settled value into them. And that will be when the promise settles. And this will be a lot clearer later on as well. So we're going to, with pending, we're going to save the then and rejected callbacks. So we're going to save those out here. And then if the promise is fulfilled, so if promise fulfilled, we're going to call the unfulfilled function that we get back, or call back. So if the promise is fulfilled, the happy state, then we're just simply going to call the unfulfilled function that we get back, or that we get when obviously the then is actually called. So we call the unfulfilled. And then if for whatever reason the promise fails, so when it's sort of rejected, then we call, so if promise fails or rejected, then we call the unrejected callback, like so. Okay, so we're going to break this up into sort of different things here. So this is essentially what the then function actually does, and then we're going to translate this into code now. Okay, so let's start with the returning a new promise here. So remember, the then function is itself is an actual promise. So we need to return a new promise here. So we're going to say return new, but we're going to return a new instance of the my promise, so our own implementation. So we're going to return my promise. So remember, so my promise again is going to take the executor function, and we're going to pass our executor function. So we're going to pass a arrow function, and again, the arrow function is going to be given the resolve and reject methods here, just like we're doing in our constructor function here. So we're passing this and this here. So we're using our own implementation of the promise here, as you can see. Okay, so we're going to go inside into the executor function, and this is where we're going to do all these things that we've just mentioned here. So I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to cut it rather, and I'm going to stick this inside here. Okay, so right, so now we've returned a new promise. The next step now is to check the status of the pending. So if it's still pending, so if the state is still pending, then we need to save those callbacks, and that's what we're going to do. So we're going to come here, and we're going to do an if check here. So we're going to say if, and then we're going to check our local state here. So if this, and then remember it's a private variable. So if this state, okay, and if the state is equal to, and then we're going to use our object from the promise state that we have here at the top here. If the state is equal to pending, then that means the promise has not settled yet. So what we need to do now is we need to save that callback into the property here that we have, which is the then callback. And to do that, we simply call this dot then. So just make sure you got the hash there. This dot then callback. And remember, this is an array, so we can simply just say push, and then we're going to push the unfulfilled function there. But what we're going to do actually is we're going to have our own function, because before we pass the value, there's a few things that we need to do. So we're going to call our own function, and we're going to call it the unfulfilled with resolve here. So we're going to push a copy of unfulfilled with resolve. This doesn't actually exist just yet. So in fact, what we can do is we can come, so we're just going to come here, and I'm going to call this one const unfulfilled, and this will be a function that we're going to add some stuff to in just now. So when the state is pending, so our promise hasn't settled yet, we're going to call, or we're going to push the unfulfilled with resolve into the then callback, which will be called back later on when the promise settles. So hopefully, if it doesn't make sense just yet, it will do once we we connect all the dots together. So just hang in there. Okay, so this dot then callback is going to add the instance of unfulfilled with promise, which we're going to create in just a moment. And that's when the state is pending. And we also need to do the opposite of that. So if it's obviously when it's rejected, then we need to have that function ready as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to simply do the same thing. So we're going to say this dot, but this time we're going to say the catch callback. Okay, so this property here, again, it's an array, and we're going to push in here the unrejected one. So we're going to unreject it with resolve. So we're going to do the same thing. And again, we need to have that created just here for us ready. And then we're going to add this in just a moment. So when it's pending, we're going to save the unfulfilled with resolve and unfulfilled with, or unrejected with resolve. And that's when the promise hasn't settled yet. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is if the promise fulfilled, we just simply call the unfulfilled with resolve. And that's all we need to do here. So we're going to do another check here. And we're going to say if or else if the state is equal to promise state dot fulfilled, then we simply need to call the unfulfilled function that we've just created. So I'm just going to put that in here just to save a bit of time. So the state, when it's fulfilled, we simply call the onResolve with fulfilled. Again, we're going to populate that in just a moment. And if the state is failed, so in the case state, not the state has failed, but the promise has failed or has been rejected, then we simply call the unrejected with resolve, which we have right here. Okay, so this kind of lays out the then for us. Obviously, it still hasn't been finished just yet, so it's not going to work 100%. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to work on the unfulfilled with resolve and the unrejected with resolve functions, the custom helper functions that we've just added. So right now we have the framework, or we've got the then function now set up for us nicely here. Now, the next thing we want to do now is we want to actually add the unfulfilled with resolve. So this function is not doing anything at the moment. So this is what we're going to be working on. And this will be called when the promise has fulfilled. So when the promise fulfills, it's going to call the unfulfilled with resolve here. And inside here, we're going to need to do a few things here. So this is where most of the processing is going to take place. So inside here, again, we're going to write out some pseudocode, and then we're going to write some code. So the first thing we want to do here is the unfulfilled function. We're going to get this passed as a callback here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to check if the callback function is actually passed. So we need to make sure that we do actually get a callback function before we do anything else with it. So we're going to check if callback function is passed. So we're going to check if the callback function is passed. And then the next thing we want to do now is we want to call the unfulfilled callback and then pass the settled value. So that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to call unfulfilled. So this function here, so we're going to call this unfulfilled function, and we're going to call this callback and pass the settled value. Okay. And then we need to check something else. So we're just going to put a note in here say that if the returned value from the unfulfilled, so the unfulfilled is going to return something. If it returns something, we want to then set that to be the value that we return, basically. So we're going to resolve that with the value. So we're going to call the unfulfilled and then pass the settled value. And then we're going to call the resolve. So we're going to call resolve, and then we're going to pass the value that comes back from the unfulfilled function. So okay, so I'm just going to put that note there. So this is just like a quick overhead of all the steps that we kind of need to take. Obviously, there might be more steps sort of involved, sub-steps involved in each step here. So the first one is easy enough here. So we're going to check, we're going to do a quick check here if we have an unfulfilled function passed to us. So we're going to do a check here. We're going to say if there is no unfulfilled here. We're simply going to return, we're going to call the resolve function. So we're going to call resolve. So there's this resolve here. So it's not the resolve on this current promise that we're actually talking about. It's the new promise that is returned by this then method here. So again, then method returns a new promise. So we're going to resolve it, and we're simply going to resolve it with the current value that is in the new instance of the promise that we return. So it's going to be this dot value, like so. So if we don't get past an onFulfilled function, we're simply going to return, and then we're going to pass it the value that it was settled with. Okay, so that's the state where we don't get a onFulfilled function. So the next bit is we need to call the onFulfilled and pass the settled value. So again here, we're going to check before we do a check here, we're going to basically create a value variable, and then we're going to then use that value to then pass it to our onResolve here. And let's actually try and catch that, because what can happen is that if the onFulfilled function that we pass, if at any point it basically throws an error, we want to catch that, and then we also want to reject that error as well. So again, we're going to use the try and catch mechanism here again. And inside the try block here, we're going to try and resolve the value that we get. So just outside of our try here, we're going to create a value, and then we're going to call the onFulfilled function. So this is the one that comes back here. We're going to call this one here, and then we're going to pass in this dot value. Okay, so we're passing in here this dot value here. Now this dot value here is coming from our value inside this promise here. Okay, so we're not referring to the new instance here, so we're actually referring to the value from the promise, the original promise, not the one that's returned by the then here. Okay, so this dot value, and we're going to pass that to the onFulfilled here. And then inside of the try block now, what we're going to do is we're going to say, we're going to call the resolve, so the resolve on the new promise here, and we're going to pass in the value. Okay, and then again, we're going to want to account for the situation where the onFulfilled callback throws an error. And if it does throw an error, we're going to reject that with this promises reject here. So the new promise is reject, we're going to reject it, and we're going to reject it with the error that was thrown by the onFulfilled callback, if there is any. Okay, so that pretty much does the job for the onFulfilled with resolve here. But there's just something important that's that I want to point your attention to. And that is, we discussed the microtask queue, and we discussed the task queue when we talked about the event loop previously. Now, in order for us to actually queue up a new promise, we have to put it in the microtask queue. And if you remember, the microtask queue is used by promises, async await, and other processes. And in fact, we can actually queue a microtask from the code directly. And there is a function for this that's natively available, provided by the JavaScript runtime environment. So what we're going to do now is we're going to queue up our task here, which is to resolve the value as a microtask. And to do that, we simply call the queue microtask. So this is a function that's natively available from the JavaScript engine here. And what we're going to do is we're going to give it a callback, like so. So it takes a callback. And inside that callback is where we want to execute the code here that we're trying to fulfill. So basically, we're going to put everything inside the microtask here. So the microtask, if you remember, is used by promises. And what's going to happen is it's going to be queued up in the microtask queue. And once the standard tasks finish and the call stack is clear, it's then going to get run by the event loop before the task queue. So that's what we're doing there. So we can actually initiate this from code, and to do that we use the queue microtask callback function there. And we pass in our callback function, and then inside this callback function is where we actually resolve our promise that we return from the .then method. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so right now we've got the try and we've got the sort of catch if the unfulfilled callback throws an error. And we've pretty much done everything we need to do for the unfulfilled with resolve. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to do a similar thing, but this time we're going to do it for the unrejected with resolve. Okay, so right now we've got the unfulfilled with resolve function. So this was our helper function that gets called when the promise is fulfilled, and it gets queued when the promise is pending. So it gets added to the callback stack, or it gets added to callback array here, and it gets called when the promise gets resolved, or each and every callback function that we get passed anyway. So we've done this one. So now we want to add the unrejected with resolve here. So when there's a problem, and we're going to add the code for this one here now. So this is going to be very similar to the unfulfilled with resolve. So the first thing we need to do is we need to check that we do have an unrejected function passed to us. So we're going to do the same thing that we did with the unfulfilled. And if we don't have an unrejected function passed to us, then we're simply going to return. So we're simply going to reject the promise here. So we're going to call reject, and again we're going to pass the this and hash value, so the value that was settled on. So that's if we don't get an unrejected callback function there. Okay, so that's that scenario taken care of. And again, we need to queue a micro task just like we did for the unfulfilled version. And we're going to pass it a callback function, and inside this callback function now we're going to do the try and catch like we had previously. So we're going to have a try, and we're going to have the catch, so now inside of the try block we're going to try and add the value. So we're going to say const value, and we're going to call the unrejected. So again, the unrejected here is coming from the callback function that gets passed when the .then is called. And we're going to pass the unrejected, and we're going to pass, similar to what we did already, this hash or this dot value, obviously value being a private property here. And then we're going to call resolve. So the resolve here is this one. So we're resolving this promise that we're returning. So we're going to call resolve, and we're going to pass in the value, so whatever is returned by the unrejected function. And again, if the unrejected function happens to throw an error, we want to call reject, and we want to settle that with the error that was called by the onReject function callback. Okay, so that does the onReject with resolve here, and that is called when the promise.state is rejected. It's going to call the onRejected with resolve. Again, if it's pending, it's going to get queued and it's going to get added to the catch callback array there. Okay, so we can just delete the pseudocode now since we've actually added the code. So right now I want to now go onto the catch method inside our promise here. So we've pretty much finished the then. So we've finished the then method. Now we're going to add the catch method. Now the catch method, if you remember, is just a wrapper for the then, with this being null and then unrejected. So all we need to do here is we're simply going to return this dot then, okay, and we're going to pass null as the first parameter, and we're going to pass the onRejected function that we get back here. So again, the catch here is simply a wrapper. So it's going to come in here into the then. Obviously we've passed a null or a falsy value for the first parameter, and we've passed a callback function for this one here. So what's going to happen is it's obviously going to be the rejected state. So it's going to call the onRejected here, and then it's basically going to execute this onRejected with resolve. So for the catch method there, that's all we need to do. So fairly straightforward there. Okay, so that's the catch done. The next bit we want to now do is the resolve. So for the actual my promise implementation, what happens when we resolve a value? So when the promise settles, what's going to happen? So the first thing that's going to happen is we need to add a value to this dot value. So if you remember, this dot value is the private variable that we've basically set up here. So we need to add a value for this one. Initially, it's set to null. So we're going to say this dot value, and this is going to be equal to the value that gets passed in here. Okay, so the value that we pass in here is going to be the value that we're going to settle it with, and then we obviously have been using that to settle the value. So when we call resolve here, then what happens is that it's going to call this method, which is the resolve here. We're going to get passed a value, and that value is going to be the value that the promise is going to be settled with. Okay, so this dot value, and then there's the state. So we need to set the state here. So this, and we're going to set the state like so. So we're going to say promise state, and now what's going to be the state when it gets resolved? It's going to be fulfilled. So we're going to say promise state dot fulfilled, and we're going to set it to be fulfilled. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to call any callback functions. So we're going to say this dot the then callback, when obviously the promise has not been rejected. We're going to go through the array. So if you remember, it's an array, so we can use a for each on that one. And then for each item, which is a function, so each callback function that's been registered, we're going to call that callback function, and we're going to execute it. Okay, so we're going to return a call to that callback function like so. So the way in which this works here is, it might be slightly confusing. You might be thinking, where is the parameter to the unfulfilled with resolve here? Now, unfulfilled with resolve, if you look over here, what's going to happen is it's using the resolve, and it's also using the this dot value for the promise here. So what happens is, when we save a copy of this and we're going to execute it later on, it's going to get a copy of, or it's going to have access to all of the previous variables. If you remember from closures, we're going to have access to the unfulfilled and unrejected, and we can actually access any of the variables inside the then, and also have access to the resolve and this dot value from the myPromise object here, or from the myPromise class that we actually have, that the then method is actually part of. So might be a little bit confusing, but that's actually how it's working. So that is a callback copy, or that is the unfulfilled with resolve that's been queued up, and it's got access to all of its variables via a closure, and we're simply going to invoke that, and then we're going to call it. And when it gets called, then it's going to execute. It's going to call the callback function that was passed to it. It's going to give it the value, and it's going to resolve that with the resolve function for the new promise that then returns. So that's how essentially it's working. Okay, so we've done it for resolve, and that's pretty much it for resolve. And then we need to do pretty much very sort of similar thing for the reject scenario. So this dot value, now if it gets rejected, it's going to be set, and we're going to set that to be whatever the rejected value is passed in here as a parameter. So whatever value is passed in here, we're going to set that to be the rejected value. So that can be if the promise was rejected, or if the callback function threw an error, whatever it might be. And then we're going to say this, and then we're going to set the state now. So this dot state is going to be equal to promise dot rejected. So it's going to be the state now. So the state is now being rejected in this scenario, and then we're going to call any callback functions just like we did for the then callback. So we're going to call the catch callback functions. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to say for each like so, and then we're going to call the callback, and we're going to execute each callback like so. So this pretty much completes our custom promise implementation. It might be a little bit confusing to understand, but please do obviously try and have a go at this and writing out yourself. And when you do that, obviously it makes it, you know, a lot more easier to understand exactly what's happening. So this completes our promise implementation, and in the next steps we're going to be actually using this promise implementation, and instead of using the native promise that we've been using so far. So right now we've finished our implementation of our own myPromise, so our own custom promise, as opposed to using the native one here. And obviously we did this so that we can better understand how promises work and all the different mechanisms involved. So we've implemented our own promise. So let's just go over it sort of quickly in terms of how things are working. So we've got the state here, and obviously the state of the promise in terms of pending, fulfilled, or rejected. We've got the value, and then we've got two properties here, which is the then callback and the catch callback. And these basically register all the callbacks that get passed to then, and they save them when the promise is settled. It then calls all them back. And then we have our constructor function here, and it takes an executor function and it calls that function immediately. It tries to call the function and it gives it the resolve and the reject methods as two parameters. And then if there's an error, we catch that error and then we reject the promise, and then we reject it with the error that was thrown by the executor function there. And then we have the then function, and this is where most of the work is taking place. This returns a new promise. So it's an independent promise from the promise that has actually been instantiated here. So it's a new promise that it returns, and then this new promise that it returns then takes the callback function passed to it, and then it queues up a micro task, and then it takes the callback function, it calls the callback function, passes in the value from this promise here, not the new one, and then it takes that value and then it resolves that value with this new promise that we have there, such that we can sort of chain that across later on, as we'll see. And then it will try and sort of catch that, or catch in errors. And if there is an error thrown by the onFulfilled function here, this will be caught by the catch block. I'm going to reject the new promises here, and we're going to call the reject. I'm going to reject it with whatever error that was thrown by the onFulfilled function. And we pretty much do the same thing on the onRejected with resolve here, but this time it's a state where there's a rejection. We reject that error and then we resolve it with that error. And then if there's an error thrown by the onRejected callback, we catch that and then we reject this promise, call reject, with the error that was thrown by the onRejected callback. Hopefully all this is making sense. Again, I really implore you to write this out and go through it step by step, and it will make clear, it will click. So that's the then function. And then here, this is where we're doing the check initially. If it's pending, we're going to save those callbacks. If the state has fulfilled, we're going to call the onFulfilled with resolve. If the state has, so if it's rejected, we're going to call onRejected with resolve. And that is pretty much the then method. And as we said, the catch is fairly straightforward. It's basically a wrapper for the second parameter, and we pass null and then onRejected. And if it is rejected, what's going to happen is it's going to come straight here into the onThen, and it's going to call the onRejected with resolve function helper here. So that's the catch. And then we have the resolve. So we resolve a value, we set the state to be fulfilled, and then we call back any callbacks that were saved into the then callback arrays. And we do pretty much the same thing with the rejected. We add the value, we set the state to be rejected, and then we call any callback error functions that was saved in the catch callback property here. Okay, so that's in a nutshell, briefly, how my custom promise is working. Now, at the moment of truth, it will actually use that custom promise and not the native promise that we've been using here. So I've refactored the waiting for function that we've been looking at over the past few lessons, and we're now going to use our own custom promise here. So we're going to say waiting for, but instead of saying new promise, which is the native promise, we're actually instantiating a new custom my promise here. So this is pointing to the class that we have here. So we're actually going to use our own implementation. So now if I just put this in here now, so we're going to call our waiting for function. We're going to wait for Abdi, and then we're going to call the .then function. So this is our custom .then, and then we pass in our callback function like so. And obviously, provided everything is all good to go, then we then log out here. Abdi is here, and then we can return another waiting for here. So we're going to return another waiting for here. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to do what we did previously. So we were able to chain off multiple calls to .then, and that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm just going to override this one here with a sort of chained promises here. So we're going to wait for multiple people. So we're going to wait for Abdi, and we get great Abdi is here, and then we're going to return a new promise. So again, we're going to return a new promise from this promise itself, and then we're going to chain off that promise here. But as you can see here, we get Abdi back. So great Abdi is here, and then the next one, when waiting for Michelle, we get an error here. So it's not quite working as we expect. So we're getting the actual object back here. So we're getting the state, which is pending, and then we're getting the properties that we have on here. So it's not quite working as we expected. So we're not able to chain off the .then method as we did with the native version. So there's something not quite right here. So what that means is that we need to go back into our implementation here, and we need to look at the unfulfilled with resolve here. So this is where the issue is coming from. So at this moment in time, when we call the unfulfilled function, so we pass in a function here. So we say this one here, when it's unfulfilled, this callback that we pass returns a new instance. So it returns a new promise here, which is a waiting for promise here. So in our unfulfilled with resolve here, all we're doing is we're just going to take that value and we're going to resolve it. So we're not able to chain off from anything that's a promise that gets returned from the unfulfilled here. So to remedy this, we need to account for the fact that the new thing that gets returned is actually an instance of my promise, or it can be an instance of the promise that we're actually trying to implement here. So let's actually do it in code, and then we'll see what we're talking about here. So inside the key micro task here, so before we return in the try catch here, we've got the value here. Now the value in itself, we need to do a check. So we need to do a check to see that the value that's returned by unfulfilled is not itself a promise. If it is an instance of our promise, then we need to call .then and then pass in the resolve and reject methods onto it so that we can chain off directly and then have that returned for the subsequent chaining of .then when a new promise is returned. Might be slightly confusing, but let's actually do it in code and it'll make a lot of sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this inside the try block here. Actually, I'm just going to put this inside here. And then after the value, I'm going to do a check. I'm going to say if the value that's returned by the unfulfilled here. So unfulfilled is going to be, so calling the .then here, it's going to be this function here. If the value that's returned from this function that we pass, that's what we're talking about here. So if that value is an instance of, okay, so instance of, and it's going to be, if it's an instance of my promise, then what we're going to do is we're going to call the value, because that value itself now is also a promise. Slightly confusing, but it is a promise because that's what we're returning from our call here. So we're saying return waiting for. So this return here, this is a promise. So if it indeed is a promise, then we're going to call .then on that promise, and then we're going to pass in as parameters our resolve and our reject functions like so. And then what we'd like to do is we don't want to resolve it because obviously that can take some time. So what we're going to do is we're just going to return from there so that it exits early. So if it is an instance of my promise here, we're going to return early, we're going to exit, and then we're going to wait for that promise to resolve. That was that new promise that was returned inside the unfulfilled callback here. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense. Let's save that out and let's actually see if this is working as we expected. So immediately we can see Abdi is here, Michelle is here, Fahad is here, and Adam is here. And it's working exactly like the native implementation that we had previously here. Now, what I'd like to also do is to look at the situation where if there's an error. So if we had an error, so remember, we're going to replace Fahad with Mike here. I'm going to save this out and we're going to wait for Abdi. Absolutely fine. We're going to wait for Michelle. It's absolutely fine. And then we get an error with Mike here. So an unexpected error has occurred. Mike is always late here. So it's working exactly the way it was working with the native implementation of the promise here. So hopefully this has given you a real insight into how the promises or the promise API works. And again, I'm going to be upfront here. It is a bit confusing to understand that first, but once you go through this code and you type it out by hand yourself, it will actually make a lot of sense here. And the fact that we're able to chain off multiple .thens here would make sense when you understand how the then method is actually working and is able to return a new promise here. So hopefully this was useful and you were able to understand the inner workings of the promise here. Now, I obviously urge you to use the native promise and not obviously use a custom implementation that obviously we've done here or somewhere else, because as I mentioned already, the native promise has a lot of bells and whistles and has a lot more going for it than our custom implementation that we have here. Okay, so now I want to have a look at other promise methods that are available with the Promise API here. So if you go to the MDN docs here and we look at promises, you can see that there are several methods on here. So we're going to look at a few of these methods and we're going to see how they work and in what scenarios that they're actually useful for and where you would use them. So we're going to look at the Promise.all here. So we're not going to look at all of them. So we're going to look at sort of the most common ones that you're probably going to be using in your day-to-day sort of JavaScript sort of coding. So we're going to look at the Promise.all, and for the Promise.all here, this basically is a method to concurrently run multiple promises at the same time. So it takes an array of promises and it waits for all of them to resolve. Once they've all resolved, it returns all of the promise values as an array to the callback that's passed to the then function. So let's see it in action, and I think it's going to make a lot of sense then. So we're going to replace this need for chaining here. So instead of chaining these multiple calls and we're going to wait for multiple people, we're going to use the Promise.all to do it instead. So we've got our waiting for here, and I've replaced, obviously now we're using the native promise. So previously we were looking at our custom implementation, so we're using the native promise here so that we can use the Promise.all method on there. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to wait for 3 people. So we're going to wait for Abdi, Fahad and Adam here. So I'm just going to write that out here quickly. I'm going to just put them all in here. So save them in a variable. And so we've got promise 1, which is Abdi, and promise 2 is going to wait for Fahad, and promise 3 is going to wait for Adam. And we're using the waiting for promise here. So again, this returns a new promise, and that's exactly what we're going to be using. So promise 1, promise 2, and promise 3. So we've got 3 promises. Now what we can do is we can call the Promise.all method. So we're going to need to use the uppercase promise here. So this is going to call the promise native promise on the JavaScript engine here. And this takes an array of promises here. So in this array here, we're going to pass each of those promises that we have. So promise 1, and we're going to pass promise 2, and then we're going to pass promise 3, like so. And similar to what we were doing previously, we can simply attach a .then onto it here. So we're going to say .then, because obviously this is a promise, and we're going to pass our callback function to this then method here. So inside the callback function here, we're going to get some values here. So I'm going to expect some values to be returned for me here, and then I'm going to log out those values with the console log, like so. And in the case we have an error, I'm going to catch that error. So again, this is just a normal promise. So the .all basically just returns a promise, and then we can attach our .then, give it our callback function, and then we can catch any errors that may arise. So we're going to take the error object, and then we're going to log out that error or that rejection on this promise here. So I'm just going to save this out like so. So now if we run this here, we get an array of 3 people here. So as you can see here, we get Abdi, Fahad, and Adam. So that's the value that's resolved for each of the promises that we've run here. So previously we were chaining them with a .then. Now we're using the Promise.all to run 3 promises at the same time, and then simply pass in one then callback and get all the values as an array, and we get the values here as you can see. So when they all resolve, we get this array and we get all of the values, and then we can use each of these values as and how we need inside the callback that we pass to the then when they get resolved. And if for any reason there's an error, then obviously our catch here would be run. So it's going to run the catch if there's an error. So let's actually see that scenario. So instead of Fahad, we're going to replace him with Mike, and when we run this, we get an error here. So if a single instance or if a single promise here fails, all promises fail, and then the catch block here is run, and the reason for the failure is then given to you here in the parameter error. Now, Promise.all is useful when you want to perform multiple asynchronous operations concurrently and you want to wait for all of them to complete before taking on any further action. Now, some scenarios that these might be useful is, say you're loading multiple resources concurrently. If you want to load multiple resources such as images, scripts, or APIs, you can create a promise for each resource and use the Promise.all to wait for all of them to complete before loading something with them. So that is a typical use case for Promise.all. Another situation is with parallel processing. So if you have multiple computationally intensive tasks, you can use Promise.all to perform them concurrently and wait for all of them to complete before proceeding with further operations. And then you have, say, you've got batch multiple API requests. So say you're hitting 3-4 different APIs and you're getting that, aggregating that data into one sort of value that you want to use. So in this scenario, these multiple API requests to perform, you can use the Promise.all to make all of these requests at the same time and wait for all of them to complete before processing these responses from different APIs. So that's going to be very useful to use Promise.all there. And then you have, for example, say you got multiple dependent sort of operations. So you want to handle multiple operations that are dependent on each other. And if you have these operations that depend on each other's completion, you can use Promise.all to wait for all of them to complete before performing any further action. And obviously, if any of them fail, then you want the whole thing to fail because they are dependent on each other. So Promise.all here is an ideal candidate to solve that particular problem. And in general, Promise.all can be useful in any scenario where you need to perform multiple asynchronous operations concurrently and you want to wait for all of them to complete before taking further action. So right now I'd like to have a look at a sort of like a real proper example using promises. And we've been looking at promises obviously with our own implementation with the waiting for function that we created, which was a promise. Now, a real promise or a promise that's actually used in production code is with the fetch API. Now, the fetch API that's available in the browser is actually it's promise based. So it's going to return a promise for us. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to have a look at that with an example with the Giphy API. So Giphy is an API where you can retrieve some GIFs and you can pass a value onto the API and it's going to return GIFs based on that value that you specify. So let's have a look at an example here. So I'm just going to add the fetch here. So we're going to make a fetch to the API giphy.com and then we're going to obviously give our API key. And then we're going to give the value as cats here. So we want to return the sort of GIFs that are about cats. So GIFs to do with cats here. So the fetch API is promise based. So it's going to return a promise here. So what that means is we can chain a .then onto the API here. So we can do a .then on the fetch here, and the response that we get here, what we need to do is we need to make sure that we call the .json on this as well. So again, this is going to be another promise as we saw previously, and then we're going to chain another .then onto it here. So this is going to return another promise, but it's going to turn the response that we get into JSON format that we can use. And then once we get that response, we're going to take it apart and basically take out the URL, and then we're going to create an element in the page. So I'm going to create an element which is the image element, and then we're going to set the source of the image element to be the GIF URL that we got from the images.original.url from the response, and then we're going to append that to the document body here. So as you can see, whenever we refresh the page, we're going to get a sort of separate image. So just wanted to show you this in action really, because the fetch API here is a prime example of a promise-based function or promise-based API, and then we can attach a .then here, so we can actually continue chaining our .thens on it, so we can create further API requests. We can continue here, we can return things. So it's really useful. So this is something that's going to be very useful with production code, and you're probably going to sort of see in code in that's been written in the past sort of few years. It's going to be heavily sort of using promises, because as we mentioned already, because promises solve a lot of problems that we saw with callbacks when it comes to asynchronous programming with JavaScript. So hopefully this has given you some sort of a better understanding of how promises work and how asynchronous JavaScript works, and how the improvement of the language, how it's gone from obviously using callbacks now to having the promise-based approach with working with asynchronous operations, and how it's actually now much better. So we're going to leave promises there, and in the next lessons we're going to look at the async await, which is another fascinating addition to JavaScript, and we're going to learn about how that works in detail in the upcoming lessons.